The Vikreen arrived without warning and without malice. Their invasion of the frontier colony on Kepler 186f was not an act of passion, but of biology. They were a swarm, a perfect locust-like species of insectoids whose societal structure was a beautiful, terrifying, and flawless expression of communal survival. Their great chitinous bioships, things of living, hardened resin, and shimmering, organic membranes darkened the sky of the colony world, which the human inhabitants had, with a profound lack of foresight, named Haven. The Vikreen warriors were the stuff of nightmares. They stood 3 meters tall, their bodies a sleek, efficient fusion of obsidian-black carapace and sinewy, exposed muscle. They had 4 arms, 2 ending in razor-sharp, scythe-like claws for combat, and 2 smaller, more delicate manipulators for complex tasks. Their heads were triangular, dominated by multifaceted, ruby-red eyes that saw the world not as a place of beauty or terror, but as a collection of resources to be analyzed, categorized, and consumed. They did not feel hate or anger or greed. They were driven by a single, pure, and implacable purpose: to harvest. And humanity, in all its soft, fleshy, and inefficient glory, was simply the dominant and most inconvenient form of native fauna to be cleared before the real work could begin. The initial assault was a masterpiece of silent, overwhelming force. The Vikreen did not use explosives or energy weapons, which they considered inefficient and messy. They used biology. They released swarms of smaller, beetle-like drones that consumed metal and plastics, dissolving the colonists' vehicles and defensive structures into a fine gray dust. They deployed fungal spores that grew at an exponential rate, their thick, fibrous mycelia clogging the barrels of pulse rifles and shorting out the power conduits of the colony's energy shields. Their victory was a foregone conclusion, a simple, biological equation that had been solved 1,000 times before on 1,000 other worlds. Sergeant Eris Thorne of the Colonial Defense Force was a man who understood equations. He understood the math of a failing perimeter, of dwindling ammunition, of a casualty rate that was climbing with the terrifying exponential curve of a plague. He and his squad, the last remnants of Haven's professional military, were engaged in a slow, desperate, and utterly hopeless fighting retreat toward the colony's central administration building, where the last of the civilian population was being herded into a subterranean emergency shelter. They were not fighting for victory. Victory had been a laughable fantasy since the first hour of the invasion. They were fighting for time, buying a few precious, blood-soaked minutes with their lives so that a few more doctors, a few more engineers, a few more children could make it to the relative safety of the bunker. The air was thick with the Vikreen's unique cloying scent, a smell of ozone and damp, freshly turned earth. The only sound was the rhythmic, chitinous clatter of their feet on the pavement and the wet, tearing sound of their claws finding soft, human flesh. The Vikreen did not scream or roar. They were as silent in their slaughter as a surgeon in their work. Eris, his pulse rifle running on its last power pack, looked at the advancing, silent, ruby-eyed tide of black carapaces, and he understood with a profound and strangely calm certainty that his story, and the story of Haven, was about to come to a clean, logical, and brutally efficient end. The final stand was in the atrium of the colony's primary education center, a large open space that had, a day before, been filled with the sound of children's laughter. Now, it was a tomb, its brightly colored walls spattered with the gray dust of the Vikreen's disintegrator drones. Eris and the last 4 members of his squad had their backs to the reinforced blast doors of the shelter, a final, futile line of defense for the hundreds of civilians cowering within. The main entrance to the atrium shattered, and the Vikreen began to pour in, their silent, scythe-like claws glinting in the dying emergency lights. Eris fired his rifle until the power pack sputtered and died. He threw his last concussion grenade, which barely staggered the lead warrior. He was out of options, out of time, out of hope. And then he saw it. Lying on the floor near his feet was a discarded plastic pumpkin, the kind of cheap, garish bucket that children used to collect candy on Halloween. The colony's annual fall festival had been scheduled for that very evening. The pumpkin was filled to the brim with the bright, colorful, and individually wrapped junk food of a dozen human corporations. It was not a conscious thought. It was a final, desperate, and utterly insane act of a man with nothing left to lose. He scooped up a double handful of the candy, chocolate bars, lollipops, packets of sour, chewy gummies, and with a final, defiant roar that was shockingly loud in the silence of the Vikreen advance, he hurled it at the face of the lead warrior, the Vikreen commander, a massive creature whose carapace was scarred with the marks of 100 campaigns, reacted with perfect, cold, and analytical precision. It saw the small, brightly colored projectiles, and its mind, which was a biological supercomputer, immediately began to analyze the threat. It identified them as a potential form of human biological warfare, a last-ditch attempt to deliver a chemical or viral agent. Its warrior protocol was clear. It must analyze the weapon, understand its nature, and, if possible, develop an immediate biological countermeasure. One of its smaller, delicate manipulator claws snatched a falling foil-wrapped chocolate bar from the air. Its mandibles, which were capable of shearing through plasteel, delicately peeled back the wrapper. It brought the small, brown, and strangely aromatic block to its mouth and, with a single clinical bite, consumed it. The effect was instantaneous, and it was absolute. The Vikreen metabolic system, a marvel of evolutionary efficiency, was designed to process the simple, elegant energy of proteins and lipids. It had evolved over millions of years in a biosphere that was almost entirely devoid of complex sugars. It had no frame of reference, no biological pathway. For the sudden, overwhelming, and chemically pure onslaught of theobromine, refined sucrose, and high-fructose corn syrup, the warrior's ruby-red, multifaceted eyes, which had been cold, analytical pools of silent judgment, suddenly dilated, the individual facets swirling with a chaotic, psychedelic explosion of color. Its antennae, which had been rigid and alert, began to twitch and vibrate, not with alarm, but with a strange, ecstatic rhythm. Its entire 3-meter-tall frame was seized by a violent, full-body tremor. A low, chittering sound, a sound no human had ever heard before, began to emanate from its thorax, a sound of pure, unadulterated, and overwhelming pleasure. The warrior's cold, logical mind, a mind that had calmly processed the extermination of entire species, had been utterly and irrevocably shattered by a wave of pure, weaponized euphoria. The greatest warrior of the Vikreen swarm had just discovered chocolate. The Vikreen commander stood, twitching, in the center of the atrium, its scythe-like claws hanging limp at its sides. Its entire, formidable being was now focused on a single, all-consuming purpose, to re-experience the sensation that was currently setting every one of its neural pathways on fire. It dropped to its knees, a gesture so alien and so subservient that its own comrades faltered in their advance, and it began to frantically scrabble at the scattered candy on the floor. It found a lollipop, and with a clumsy, desperate haste, it crushed the entire thing, plastic stick and all, into its mouth. A new wave of ecstatic chittering filled the atrium. The other Vikreen warriors paused, their perfect, silent hive-mind communication suddenly flooded with the psychic equivalent of ecstatic, incoherent gibberish from their commander. They were receiving not tactical data, but a pure, unfiltered broadcast of overwhelming sensory bliss. It was a logical paradox, a piece of data so corrupt and so alien that their own minds could not process it. Their advance, which had been a flowing, unstoppable river of death, slowed to a confused, hesitant trickle. Eris Thorne stared, his own mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The monster that had been about to tear him limb from limb was now sitting on the floor, happily and noisily crunching on a sour, gummy worm, its multifaceted eyes spinning like crystalline pinwheels. He saw his chance. "Go!" he screamed at his squad, his voice cracking. "Back to the shelter! Now!" They didn't need to be told twice. The last 4 soldiers of Haven, their faces a mask of stunned, terrified disbelief, scrambled through the blast doors as Eris laid down a covering fire of more candy. He emptied the rest of the plastic pumpkin onto the floor, creating a colorful, sugary minefield between the confused Vikreen and the shelter. As the blast door sealed behind him, the last thing he saw was two more Vakreen warriors cautiously approaching the scattered suites, their antennae twitching with a fatal and deeply unwarrior-like curiosity. His report, screamed over the shelter's emergency comm system to the colony's command staff, was met with exactly the response he expected: stunned, angry disbelief. But there was one person in the command bunker who did not dismiss his frantic, insane story. Dr. Alara Vance was a xenobiologist who had been studying the Vakreen from a safe distance for months, analyzing the physiology of the few disintegrator drones they had managed to capture. And in their simple, elegant biology, she had seen a potential and catastrophic vulnerability. "It's possible," she said, her voice cutting through the panicked arguments of the colony's leaders. The Vakreen evolved in a sugar-deprived ecosphere. Their cellular structure is a masterpiece of energy efficiency, but they have no insulin analog, no glucagon, no biological mechanism to regulate a massive, sudden influx of simple carbohydrates. To their system, a dose of refined sugar isn't just energy. It's a neurological superstimulant. It would trigger a dopamine and serotonin release on a scale that would be, for a non-addicted species, the equivalent of a direct and continuous injection of pure, uncut heroin. A slow, horrified, and brilliant idea began to form in her mind. "Get me access to the colony's central food stores," she said, her eyes alight with a new and terrifying hope. "Specifically, I need everything from the non-essential snack food and confectionery aisles. We are about to conduct the most important and most unethical biological experiment in human history." The Vakreen, in their cold, logical analysis, had written off the incident in the education center as an anomaly. The commander and the two warriors who had succumbed to the strange human neurotoxin had been dragged from the field of battle, their bodies still twitching, their minds still lost in a state of ecstatic bliss. The Vakreen hive mind had quarantined their chaotic, joyful thoughts, and the swarm, with its perfect, logical discipline, had recalibrated. They had identified a new and minor human weapon, and they would adapt. The final assault on the colony's central command bunker, the last pocket of organized resistance, would proceed as planned. The Vakreen swarmed through the deserted, silent streets of Haven, their objective the great, reinforced plasteel dome of the administration building. They moved with a renewed and chilling sense of purpose. But as they approached the plaza in front of the building, they encountered a new and deeply strange human defense. The entire plaza was littered with them: piles of brightly colored foil-wrapped chocolates, small, gelatinous, bear-shaped candies, long, sticky ropes of red licorice, and in the center of the plaza, a hastily constructed barricade made not of sandbags and barbed wire, but of crates of soda, boxes of donuts, and massive, institutional-sized bags of marshmallows. The Vakreen advance faltered. Their new orders were to avoid the brightly colored human bioweapons. But the scent? The scent was overwhelming. The air, which had been filled with the smell of ozone and death, was now thick with the intoxicating and deeply alluring aroma of artificial vanilla, of caramelized sugar, of 1,000 different and equally seductive chemical flavorings. The Vakreen's formidable warrior discipline was now fighting a war on two fronts, one against the last remnants of the human defenders, and a new and far more insidious one against their own, newly awakened and screamingly insistent, biology. From the rooftops of the surrounding buildings, the human counterattack began. It was not a volley of pulse rifle fire or a barrage of grenades. It was a shower of pure weaponized sugar. Modified grenade launchers, their barrels widened, fired canisters that burst in the air, raining down a sticky, sweet mist of high-fructose corn syrup. Automated drone launchers, which had once fired micro-missiles, now dropped bags of powdered sugar donuts onto the heads of the advancing warriors. From behind the barricade, Eris and his squad used a jury-rigged compressed air catapult to launch entire birthday cakes into the heart of the Vakreen formation. The effect was not a battle. It was a contagion. The first Vakreen to be hit by a splash of soda paused, its warrior instincts compelling it to clean the strange, sticky substance from its carapace. It brought its manipulator claw to its mouth, and its world ended in a fizz of carbonated, sugary bliss. Its ecstatic psychic scream echoed through the hive mind, but this time it was not an isolated incident. It was a chorus. All across the plaza, the disciplined, silent Vakreen warriors were being exposed, and every single one of them was falling, the perfect, logical, and terrifyingly efficient Vakreen swarm, the scourge of a dozen star systems, collapsed. The battlefield was no longer a scene of slaughter. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated, and deeply disturbing debauchery. Warriors, their eyes swirling with psychedelic color, fought each other, not for tactical advantage, but for the last chocolate bar in a dropped ration pack. A unit of elite Vakreen shock troopers, the most feared warriors in the swarm, was found lying in a circle, their heads together in a puddle of spilled syrup, their antennae twitching in a state of shared, blissful unconsciousness. The great final assault on Haven had been stopped, not by a wall of steel, but by a wall of diabetes. As the human defenders stared in stunned, horrified silence at the writhing, chittering, and blissfully incapacitated army before them, a single, plaintive message was broadcast from the Vakreen command ship in orbit. It was not a demand for surrender. It was a simple one-word query, a question that would change the course of human history forever. More? The war was over. The negotiation for the fate of the human race was about to begin, and the primary currency was going to be a Snickers bar. The single-word broadcast from the Vakreen command ship hung in the silent command bunker of Haven like a judgment. More? It was not a question. It was a plea, a desperate, raw, and utterly alien expression of need. The war was over, but in its place was a new and terrifyingly uncertain peace. The human defenders, standing on their barricades of donuts and marshmallows, were no longer soldiers. They were the bewildered keepers of a zoo full of twitching, sugar-crazed junkies. Dr. Alara Vance became the de facto ambassador for this new, strange reality. With Eris Thorne providing tactical support and a running, disbelieving commentary from the barricade, Ilara opened a communication channel to the Vakreen overlord. The being she communicated with was not the cold, implacable, logical intelligence she had expected. The hive mind, the perfect silent symphony of the Vakreen swarm, was in a state of catastrophic systemic shock. The overlord's thoughts, which should have been a clear, clean signal, were a chaotic, noisy storm of second-hand euphoria, vicarious bliss, and the dawning, species-wide horror of a collective, and very, very bad trip. The substance, the overlord's thoughts projected, a strained, desperate signal that was a universe away from the silent, confident threat of a day before. It has recalibrated our core function. The directive to harvest is secondary. The directive to experience is now primary. Our warriors are compromised. Their feedback loop is a continuous, illogical cascade of sensory overload. We require more of the substance to stabilize them. Without it, the cascade may become permanent. The implication was clear. The Vakreen warriors on the ground were not just high. They were trapped in a state of perpetual ecstatic seizure. Their minds, and by extension the hive mind itself, were being flooded with a signal of pure, weaponized joy that was threatening to burn them out from the inside. They needed more sugar, not for the high, but as a form of bizarre, paradoxical methadone to bring them down from the catastrophic initial overdose. The negotiation was short, and humanity held all the cards. Ilara, her mind reeling with the ethical and biological implications of what she was about to do, laid out the terms. Humanity would provide a steady, controlled supply of the substance. In exchange, the Vakreen would cease all hostilities, not just against Haven, but against the entirety of the Terran Federation. They would withdraw their fleets from human space. They would share their advanced biological technology, and they would declare a permanent, binding, and exclusive trade agreement with the colony of Haven. Humanity, a species that had been on the verge of becoming a footnote in the Vakreen's harvest logs, had just stumbled backward into becoming the sole and unwilling drug cartel for the most powerful and dangerous species in the sector. The colony of Haven underwent a transformation that was as profound as it was absurd. The planetary defense grid was dismantled, its power rerouted to the colony's primary food synthesis plants. The emergency shelter, once a bastion of last resort, was converted into a massive, climate-controlled warehouse for the storage of refined sucrose and high-fructose corn syrup. Hydroponics bays that had been dedicated to growing nutrient-rich, life-sustaining kelp were ripped out and replaced with towering stalks of genetically modified sugarcane and corn. The colony was no longer a fledgling outpost of human hope. It was a drug lab, a planetary-scale confectionery factory, and the most important and most morally compromised world in the Terran Federation, Eris Thorne, the grizzled sergeant who had fired the first sugary shot of the war, found himself in the surreal and deeply uncomfortable position of being the new head of distribution and interspecies relations. His job was to oversee the daily shipment, a carefully measured and scientifically formulated ration of sugary products that was delivered to the Vikreen. He would meet them at the edge of the city, his small, unarmored transport laden with crates of specially designed, nutrient-poor, and highly addictive candy bars. The Vikreen he dealt with were no longer the silent, terrifying warriors of the invasion. They were clients. Their once gleaming obsidian carapaces were now often sticky with the residue of their last fix. Their movements no longer the crisp, efficient motions of a predator, but the twitchy, anxious jitters of an addict. They would approach the exchange point with a new and deeply unsettling emotion in their multifaceted eyes, a look of pleading, desperate anticipation. The hive mind was still present, but it was a fractured, neurotic thing, a constant low-level buzz of craving and anxiety. The body horror of their transformation was becoming more apparent. The constant, massive influx of a chemical their bodies were never designed to process was having a profound and grotesque effect. Their carapaces, which were a form of living, biological armor, began to lose their obsidian sheen, taking on a strange, almost translucent, candied glaze. Small, crystalline sugar deposits began to form in the joints of their limbs, making their movements stiff and painful. Their internal biology, a perfect engine of efficiency, was being systematically destroyed by a diet of pure, unadulterated junk food. They were, from a biological standpoint, a species that was slowly and blissfully rotting from the inside out. The perfect, logical, and terrifyingly efficient society of the Vikreen did not just collapse. It dissolved in a sticky, sweet, and tragic wave of addiction. The swarm, which had operated as a single, unified organism for millions of years, fractured into 1,000 competing factions. The concept of the individual, which had been a meaningless abstraction, was now a terrible and all-consuming reality. And the new Vikreen individual was a being defined by a single, simple, and desperate need. The hive mind, once a source of unity and strength, was now a battleground. It was a chaotic, noisy space where the thoughts of 1 trillion addicts all screamed for their next fix. The Vikreen overlord, once the calm, logical center of the swarm, was now little more than a harried, overwhelmed administrator, trying to manage the logistics of an empire that had abandoned its quest for galactic domination in favor of a quest for a better donut. New and terrifyingly familiar social structures began to emerge. Vikreen, who were more clever or more ruthless, began to hoard their rations, creating their own private stashes. They became the first Vikreen drug lords, trading their hoarded sweets for favors, for loyalty, for the service of other more desperate warriors. Fights would break out over a dropped lollipop. Entire broods would go to war over a misplaced shipment of chocolate. The silent, efficient slaughter of their harvest campaigns was replaced by the messy, passionate, and deeply illogical violence of a species tearing itself apart over the dregs of its own addiction. On Haven, Elara Vance watched the data streams, her own soul a battleground of conflicting emotions. Every report of a new Vikreen factional war, of a new outbreak of sugar-fueled violence, was a victory for the survival of her species. It was also a new and heavy weight on her conscience. She was the architect of this societal collapse. She was the one who had, with a brilliant and monstrous act of biological warfare, destroyed a civilization, not with bombs, but with candy. She would walk through the newly expanded sugar refineries, the air thick with the sweet, cloying smell of her victory, and she would feel the profound and deeply human sickness of a success that felt, in its heart, like a sin. The secret of humanity's new and bizarre form of galactic currency could not be kept forever. The Vikreen, in their desperation, began to do the one thing their old logical selves would have found unthinkable. They began to trade with other species. They offered their advanced and now poorly maintained biological technology, their star charts of conquered worlds, their very warships, to anyone who could provide them with a new source of their drug. The galactic community, which had viewed the Vikreen with a mixture of terror and awe, was now looking at them with a new and far more dangerous emotion: pity and opportunistic greed. The first of the new players to arrive in the Kepler 186F system was not a warship, but a sleek, opulent, and disgustingly cheerful-looking corporate vessel. It belonged to the Xylon Trade Guild, a species of reptilian capitalists whose philosophy was based on the simple, elegant principle of finding a need and exploiting it for a profit. They had analyzed samples of the human substance traded by the Vikreen. They had reverse-engineered its chemical structure, and they had come to Haven not to make war, but to make a business proposition. A Xylan dignitary, a tall, slender creature whose scales shimmered with a rainbow of iridescent color, met with Alara Vance and Eris Thorne in the colony's primary, and now ironically named Administration Building. The Xylan did not make threats. It made an offer. The Guild was prepared to mass-produce a synthetic and far more potent version of the human drug. They would take over the supply chain, stabilizing the Vikreen and, not incidentally, making themselves the sole proprietor of a new and fantastically profitable galactic market. All they required from humanity was the original biological formula, the patent, so to speak. In exchange, they would offer humanity a small, but generous, percentage of the profits, and, of course, their continued protection under the Guild's powerful corporate umbrella. Ilara and Eris sat in silence, the weight of the offer settling upon them. They had won their war, only to find themselves at a new and far more complex negotiating table. They were no longer fighting for their survival. They were fighting for market share. They were no longer soldiers and scientists. They were the reluctant CEOs of a species-destroying drug empire, and a larger, more ruthless corporation had just arrived with a hostile takeover bid. The absurdity of their situation had reached a new and terrifying peak. They had saved their people by becoming monsters, only to find that there were other, far more sophisticated and far more profitable monsters in the universe. The meeting with the Xylan dignitary left a scar on the collective soul of Haven. The creature's offer was a masterpiece of corporate predation, a polite, smiling, and utterly ruthless declaration of intent. Ilara Vance and Eris Thorne were no longer just the architects of a species-wide addiction. They were now the gatekeepers of a potential galactic empire built on that suffering. The choice the Xylan presented was a cage with two doors, both leading to a different kind of hell. They could accept the offer, handing over their patent to the Guild. Humanity would be rich, safe under the Guild's protection, and forever absolved of the messy, day-to-day logistics of managing the Vikreen addiction. They would be the silent, wealthy partners in a monstrous enterprise, their survival bought with the institutionalized and corporatized destruction of another species. Or they could refuse. The Xylan had made it clear in the politest and most chilling terms that their refusal would not stop the Guild. It would simply remove humanity from the equation. The Guild would flood the market with their own, more potent and completely unregulated synthetic sugar, driving the Vikreen into an even deeper, more catastrophic spiral of addiction, while simultaneously cutting Haven out of the trade loop entirely. Humanity would retain its moral high ground, and in exchange they would be left bankrupt, isolated, and watching a tragedy they had started spiral into an apocalypse they were powerless to stop. The debate that raged in the command bunker was a far cry from the panicked, desperate arguments of the invasion. This was a new and in many ways more painful kind of calculus. It was a debate about the nature of their own soul. The pragmatists, led by the colony's administrators, argued for the deal. It was the only logical choice, a way to secure their future and, they argued, to at least have some small influence over the process. The idealists argued for refusal, claiming that a survival bought at such a price was not a survival worth having. It was Eris Thorne, the soldier who had started it all with a handful of cheap candy, who found the third option. "We're looking at this like a negotiation," he said, his voice cutting through the circular arguments. "But it's not. It's a war. It's just a different kind of war. The Xylan thinks they have us in a cage, and they're right. So we stop trying to pick a door. We burn the cage down." His plan was as simple as it was audacious. They would neither accept nor refuse the Xylan's offer. They would render the entire market obsolete. While the politicians and diplomats stalled for time, engaging the Xylan in a protracted and meaningless negotiation over percentage points and distribution rights, Elara Vance would be given every resource the colony had. Her new mission was not to create a more addictive substance, but to do the one thing no one, not the Vikreen, not the Xylan, and not even her own people, thought was possible. She was going to find a cure. The Xylan Trade Guild, confident in its position, was happy to negotiate. They saw the humans' attempts to haggle as the predictable and slightly pathetic maneuvering of a species that knew it was beaten, while their delegates were entertained with lavish and ultimately pointless diplomatic functions on Haven. The Guild's great factory ships, already in position at the edge of the system, began the mass production of their new synthetic drug. They called it Nectar, a name that was as beautiful as the substance was destructive. Nectar was a masterpiece of biochemical engineering. It was a crystalline sugar that was 10 times more potent than anything humanity could produce, and it was designed to be even more addictive. The Guild, in its infinite market wisdom, began to release small, promotional shipments of nectar into the Vikreen trade routes, a free sample to hook their new customers. The effect on the Vikreen was apocalyptic. The carefully controlled, almost medicinal addiction that humanity had been managing was shattered by a new and far more terrible plague. Nectar did not just provide a euphoric high. It burned through the Vikreen's unique biology like a chemical fire. The body horror of their condition accelerated at a terrifying rate. The crystalline sugar deposits in their joints grew into great, crippling, and agonizingly painful spurs of solid, candied resin. Their carapaces, which had been taking on a glazed sheen, now began to crack and shatter as if they were made of brittle, spun sugar. The societal collapse was just as swift. The fragile, emerging structures of the Vikreen drug lords and their factions were swept away by the sheer, overwhelming power of nectar. The hive mind, which had been a noisy, chaotic storm of craving, now became a single, unified, and agonized scream. The last vestiges of their logical communal society vanished, replaced by a species-wide, single-minded, and utterly desperate obsession. The Vikreen Empire, the great silent scourge of the galaxy, was in its final twitching and agonizing death throes, and the Xylan Trade Guild's stock price had never been higher. On Haven, Elara Vance worked in a state of frantic, sleepless desperation. Her laboratory was no longer just a human facility. It was a joint venture. In their initial treaty, the Vikreen had shared their advanced biological technology, their living organic computers, their gene-splicing techniques that were centuries beyond anything humanity had developed. Now Elara, guided by the last few sane and terrified Vikreen scientists who could still be reached through the screaming chaos of the hive mind, began to use their own technology against the plague that was destroying them. She was not just a human scientist anymore. She was a surgeon, attempting a species-wide heart transplant, with the patient, the tools, and the disease all being the same terrified, dying creature. The cure, when it came, was not a simple antidote. It was a work of profound and elegant biological art. Elara and her Vikreen collaborators could not simply erase the Vikreen's addiction. The neurological pathways were too deep, the biological changes too profound. Instead, they embraced it. They created a tailored retrovirus, a piece of biological code that was designed to do one simple thing, to finish the job that evolution had never started. The virus was designed to rewrite the Vikreen genome, to give them the biological tools their species had always lacked. It would force the creation of an insulin analog, of a glucagon system, of all the complex and previously unnecessary biological machinery required to process complex sugars not as a neurotoxin, but as a simple and mundane source of food. It was a cure that would not just save them, but would irrevocably change them. It would not erase their memory of the sugar rush, but it would take away its power. It would transform their greatest and most terrible vulnerability into a common and manageable part of their own biology. The greatest and most ironic gift humanity could give them was the one thing they themselves had been fighting for centuries, a metabolism that could handle a donut. The deployment of the cure was the final and most dangerous act of the war. They could not simply release the virus into the Vikreen trade routes. The Xylan, who were monitoring everything, would detect it, analyze it, and create a countermeasure. They had to deliver it to the heart of the Vikreen swarm, to the Overlord itself, so that the cure could be disseminated through the hive mind, a wave of healing that would be faster and more pervasive than any plague. Eris Thorn, the soldier who had started it all, volunteered for the mission. He would take a single, small, and very fast ship, disguised as a simple independent trader, and he would carry a cargo that was not the cure itself, but the one thing that could guarantee him an audience with the Overlord, the last, and largest reserve of pure, unadulterated, and perfectly refined human sugar from the warehouses of Haven. He was going to make a final delivery, a last, terrible, and beautifully, wonderfully poisoned gift. Eris's journey to the Vikreen homeworld was a descent into the heart of a dying empire. He flew through star systems that were littered with the derelict, drifting hulks of Vikreen warships, their crews long dead from overdose or civil war. He saw planets whose surfaces were scarred with the crystalline, sugary growths that were the final geological tombstone of a species that had rotted from within. When he finally arrived at the Vikreen throne world, it was a scene of almost biblical devastation. The great organic cities were crumbling, and the air was thick with the sweet, cloying smell of decay. He was granted an immediate audience with the Overlord. The great ancient intelligence of the swarm was a shadow of its former self, its once perfect hive mind a fractured, agonized echo chamber of a trillion screaming needs. Eris stood before it, a single, soft, fleshy human in the heart of a dying insectoid empire, and he presented his final offering. As the Vikreen Royal Guard, their bodies twisted and broken by their addiction, fell upon the sugar with a desperate, pathetic hunger, Eris activated the payload. A silent, invisible, and aerosolized cloud of the retrovirus filled the chamber, infecting the Overlord and its guard. And from there, the hive mind, and from there, the species. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was absolute. A new wave of information began to spread through the hive mind, a wave not of craving, but of change, a wave of healing, a wave of a profound and deeply unfamiliar sense of biological peace. When the Xylan Trade Guild learned what had happened, their reaction was not one of anger, but of cold, reptilian, and purely financial calculation. Their market had vanished overnight. The Vikreen, their most profitable and most captive customer base, were cured. The guild did the only logical thing a ruthless, capitalist empire could do. They cut their losses, wrote off the entire disastrous venture, and silently, and with a profound sense of professional respect for a species that had so thoroughly and so creatively outmaneuvered them, they withdrew their fleets and went in search of a new and less complicated market to exploit. The war, in all its strange, terrible, and absurd forms, was finally over. The Vikreen were saved, but they were forever changed. The memory of the sugar rush was burned into their collective consciousness, a cultural scar that would forever remind them of their brush with extinction. They were no longer the silent, logical, and terrifying scourge of the galaxy. They were a species in recovery, a civilization of survivors who now had a complex and deeply respectful relationship with the small, soft, and terrifyingly creative race of beings who had been both their destroyers and their saviors. Humanity had not just won a war, they had, in the most bizarre and unexpected way imaginable, made a friend. And they had taught the galaxy a new and vital lesson, that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe is not a bomb, but an act of profound and deeply, sweetly redemptive kindness.